A river's current once held the power to make kings and beggars. This is the forgotten story of 25 river priests, spiritual figures who redirected medieval trade by shifting sacred currents. You will discover exactly how faith alone could move the flow of wealth across entire continents. We will uncover why merchants obeyed spiritual decrees over practical logic and how a single blessing could create a bustling city from nothing. What hidden force do you think truly controls the economy, logic, or belief? These figures stood at the water's edge, their ceremonial robes dyed with the colors of earth and sky. They were the river priests, and their authority flowed from a source deeper than any king's decree. More than just clerics, they were the living custodians of sacred geography, belonging to orders that saw a divine spirit in every rushing current and still pool. Their power was a unique fusion of deep spiritual faith and a remarkably practical understanding of the river's own language. They could read the subtle signs of the water, predicting its floods and droughts, its shifting sandbars and changing channels. This was not magic in the way we might think of it today. It was a form of sacred stewardship, a belief that through ritual and prayer, one could align with the river's will and, on rare occasions, gently suggest a new direction. Merchant caravans and ship captains did not just respect them, they feared their disfavor. A blessing could mean a safe journey and booming profits, while a curse could mean a silt-choked harbor or a sudden, treacherous sandbar appearing where none had been before. They were the ultimate mediators, the bridge between the tangible world of goods and gold and the intangible world of divine favor. To understand how faith could reroute entire economies, you must first see the world through their eyes, a place where a river was not just water, but a living god. A river's name was more than a label, it was an identity. The Danube was not simply the Danube, it was a winding, ancient god whose moods could bless a harvest or wash a village away. The Rhine was not merely a river but a mythic boundary between worlds, its depths home to spirits and its currents a path for the dead. In the medieval mind, these waterways were living, breathing entities. They were ancestors watching over the land, thresholds to realms beyond human sight, and physical expressions of a divine will that shaped every aspect of life. This belief was not a quaint superstition, it was the very bedrock of society. Why did the greatest cities rise on riverbanks? It was not just for the fresh water. It was for the proximity to the sacred. A settlement on the banks of a revered river was like building your home in the courtyard of a temple. You were under the protection of a power greater than any army. Trade routes did not just follow the path of least resistance, they followed the path of divine favor. A merchant sailing his barge down a holy river was not just a businessman on a journey, he was a pilgrim navigating the veins of a god. This is where the river priests found their ultimate leverage. The current itself was seen as the river's spiritual force, a liquid expression of its will. A strong, clear current meant the deity was pleased, its blessings flowing downstream, carrying ships and prosperity with it. A sluggish or choked current was a sign of divine displeasure, a spiritual stagnation that no amount of engineering could fix. So when a river priest, standing at the water's edge in his ceremonial robes, declared a particular current sacred, he was doing far more than making a spiritual pronouncement. He was issuing a divine passport. That stretch of water was now officially under the favor of the god, and merchants would flock to it, trusting the current to carry them safely and their goods to market. Conversely, to curse a current was to unleash a kind of spiritual quarantine. No captain with any sense would risk his ship, his cargo, and his soul to a waterway declared spiritually polluted. The priest did not need to block the river with stones or logs. He could block it with a single word, redirecting the flow of wealth simply by redirecting the flow of faith. The Rhine Guardian moved through a world alive with unseen currents. He was a priest of a cult devoted to the river's ancient spirit, a man whose authority was whispered on the wind that ruffled the water's surface. His moment of profound influence began not with a grand political maneuver, but with a quiet vision. He declared that a certain minor tributary, a stream most merchants had considered a backwater, was suddenly and powerfully blessed. The river spirit itself, he claimed, had shown him this new path in a dream, promising safe passage and great fortune to those who honored its waters. Salt was the lifeblood of the medieval world, used to preserve food and sustain communities, and its trade routes were fiercely contested. At the time, a powerful consortium of merchants controlled the primary salt route, enforcing a tight monopoly that kept prices high and dictated terms to entire towns. The Guardian's decree offered a divine alternative. Skeptical merchants, initially hesitant to abandon the known riverways, were swayed by what they saw as miracles. A sudden, unexpected rain swelled the tributary just enough for fully laden barges to pass. A rival ship, ignoring the new blessing, ran aground on a mysterious sandbar in the old channel. These events were seen not as coincidence, but as the river spirit's clear endorsement of the priest's word. Almost overnight, the flow of commerce shifted. Salt barges, one by one, began navigating the newly sacred tributary. This single spiritual declaration shattered the existing salt monopoly, breaking the stranglehold of the wealthy consortium. Wealth and opportunity were suddenly funneled into a different set of towns along the blessed waterway, transforming sleepy river landings into bustling, prosperous ports. A single man with no army and no treasury had redirected the very flow of medieval commerce using nothing but the power of a shared belief. Deep within a secluded monastery overlooking the Danube, a different kind of power was being channeled. A priest known only as the Oracle spent his life listening to the river's whispers, interpreting the meaning in the way water swirled around rocks and the patterns of morning mist on its surface. His authority came not from public ceremony, but from a profound and unsettling solitude. Then came the pronouncement that would shake the foundations of regional trade. The oracle declared that a specific, narrower branch of the great river, one largely ignored by major shipping, now carried what he called iron-laden currents. He claimed the river spirit itself had blessed these waters specifically for carrying the heavy, vital output of the mountain mines. This was not a casual suggestion, it was a divine mandate. Bargemen who lived and died by the river's moods took his word as gospel. They began steering their clumsy, oar-filled vessels away from the traditional, well-traveled route and into the newly sanctified channel. This spiritual rerouting posed a direct threat to the local lords. Their wealth was built on the tolls and taxes collected from the old iron route, a steady stream of coin flowing directly into their coffers. They scoffed at the oracle's prophecy, dismissing it as the ramblings of a hermit. They tried to command the bargemen back, even threatening to impound ships. But how do you fight a current of faith? The bargemen held firm, bolstered by what they saw as undeniable proof. Stories spread of ships on the new route finding unexpected, perfectly clear passages through treacherous stretches. Others told of barges that seemed to glide with an unnatural speed, as if pushed by an invisible hand. These reported miracles solidified the change far more effectively than any royal decree. The lords eventually had to concede, their secular power eroding before the relentless flow of belief. Iron, the backbone of armies and tools, was now following a divine detour, all because one man in a monastery understood that the most powerful currents are not made of water, but of conviction. Far from the swift currents of the Rhine and the deep whispers of the Danube, the Loire River meandered through France's sun-drenched vineyards. Here, the keeper of the Loire tended a small shrine at a sharp, decisive bend in the river, a place where the water seemed to pause and choose its path. His authority was as gentle and pervasive as the valley mist until the dreams began. They were vivid, recurring visions of the main river channel running thick with a spiritual blight, a pollution invisible to the eye but fatal to the soul of any cargo it touched. He emerged from his solitude with a solemn decree. The primary channel, the most direct and efficient route for trade, was now spiritually corrupt. Only the slower, secondary channel held the river's pure blessing. This pronouncement struck terror into the hearts of the wine merchants. Their trade was not merely business, it was an art governed by superstition and a deep belief that a wine could absorb the character of its journey. A vintage transported through a spiritually polluted current, they feared, would turn sour, vinegary, or worse, be utterly devoid of joy. The keeper's warning was not about shipwrecks or sandbars, but about a corruption that could seep through the wooden staves of their barrels and poison their precious cargo from within. Faced with this divine threat, cold logistics became irrelevant. They abandoned the efficient main route entirely. Overnight, the wine galleys turned toward the longer, more arduous secondary channel. This decision defied all earthly reason. The new path added days to their journey and significantly increased their costs for labor and tolls. Yet they paid the price willingly, a tax levied not by a king but by their own fear. The value of their wine was intrinsically tied to its perceived purity, and a blessed journey protected that value far more than any speedier transit could. The keeper, without a single soldier or coin to his name, had leveraged this spiritual fear into a powerful economic lever. He demonstrated that faith could force commerce down a less profitable path, proving that the most powerful obstacles are not mountains but beliefs. While the keeper of the Loire spoke of spiritual blight, a different kind of declaration echoed from the banks of the Tyber. In the heart of the Papal States, a priest known as the voice of the Tyber held a power that could command the very sustenance of Rome. His authority was absolute, drawn from the sacred history of the river that flowed through the eternal city. One day, he made a pronouncement that was less a spiritual revelation and more a strategic masterstroke. He declared the river's central and most powerful current to be sanctified, a holy waterway reserved exclusively for a single purpose. Only the barges carrying grain for the Pope's armies and for feeding the city of Rome itself were deemed worthy of its divine flow. This was not a subtle suggestion, it was a spiritual blockade. The most efficient, swift, and reliable part of the river was now, by divine right, privatized. Commercial grain traders, the lifeblood of regional commerce, were suddenly expelled from the sacred current. They were forced to navigate the slower, silt-laden side channels, where unpredictable currents and shallow waters made their journeys longer, more expensive, and far less reliable. The effect was immediate and devastating for rival city-states. Their grain shipments, now delayed and diminished, lost their competitive edge in the markets. The price of their goods rose with the increased cost of transport, while the Pope's own grain flowed swiftly and cheaply down the blessed central lane. This was faith weaponized. The voice of the Tyber had blurred the line between church and state so completely that they became one and the same. A sacred decree was used not just to secure a food supply, but to wage a silent economic war, demonstrating that the most potent blessings were often those that served the most earthly powers. How did these priests maintain their incredible authority across generations? The answer lies not in the rivers themselves, but in the creation of an unbreakable system of belief. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the river itself. Each year, the priest known as the Severn's Chanter would stand at the water's edge and perform the ancient rites, his sung verses believed to guide the current and keep the river's spirit content. The ceremony was a cornerstone of local life, a reaffirmation of the natural and economic order. But one year, the chanter did the unthinkable. He changed the words. The familiar, comforting lyrics that had always blessed the traditional landing ports were subtly altered. The sacred favor was now being sung toward a different set of docks further downstream. To an outsider, it might have seemed a minor artistic choice, but to the powerful guild of wool merchants who depended on the Severn, it was a seismic shift. They believed the chant itself wove a protective charm around their cargo. A barge leaving from a blessed port, they were certain, would not only find safe passage across the sea to Flanders, but would also find eager buyers and top prices for its wool. The chanter's new song promised that divine fortune, and they trusted the ritual's efficacy completely. Almost immediately, the guild began moving its operations. The economic impact was as swift as it was decisive. The newly blessed ports swelled with activity, their warehouses filling with the finest English wool, their quaysides bustling with ships and workers. Meanwhile, the old trading posts, just as capable logistically, were abandoned almost overnight. Their economies withered, their importance draining away with the symbolic withdrawal of the river's favor. This was not a change driven by cost analysis or navigational charts. It was driven by the power of performance, by the deep-seated belief that a ceremony could alter reality. The chanter proved that economic psychology could be harnessed through ritual, that the most entrenched commercial habits could be overridden by a simple, powerful change in a sacred song. So how did one man shift the path of a river god? The answer lies not in dredging machines or stone walls, but in the theater of belief. Shifting a sacred current was a masterful performance, a psychological operation conducted with prayer, symbol, and public spectacle. Think of a priest wading into a sluggish side channel, plunging a sacred pole carved with ancient runes into the riverbed. To our eyes, it is just a piece of wood. To the watching merchants, it was a divine lightning rod, summoning the river's spirit to inhabit that very spot, effectively rerouting the holy essence into a new physical path. Or picture a mass baptism of the waters, where a priest would lead a procession to a neglected tributary, chanting blessings and immersing holy relics. The water itself was transformed not chemically but spiritually from mundane to miraculous. This ceremonial act was a public recalibration of reality. But the most powerful tool was interpretation. A sudden summer flood that washed away a rival's dock was not a random weather event. It was a clear sign of the river's displeasure with the old route. A drought that mysteriously spared one channel while parching another was proof of divine favor. The priests were the sole translators of this divine language. Their declarations gave chaotic natural events a clear, purposeful meaning that directly served to validate the new commercial map. The shift, therefore, happened not in the water but in the human mind. It was a collective agreement forged in ritual that a different strip of water now held the magic. This psychological lever was the true engine of their power. It proves that the most accurate map of medieval commerce was not drawn with lines of latitude and longitude, but with the invisible ink of shared faith. A river priest's blessing could turn a quiet riverbank into a roaring marketplace overnight. On the newly sanctified routes, the air itself seemed to change, thick with the scent of fresh timber and baking bread. Docks that had rotted in silence were suddenly swarmed with carpenters, their hammers ringing from dawn till dusk as they extended the quays to welcome the endless stream of barges. Inns that once housed a few local farmers now overflowed with merchants from distant lands, their conversations a cacophony of languages, their purses heavy with coin. Artisans, from coopers to blacksmiths, flocked to these towns, setting up workshops to serve the booming trade. A single blessing had woven a thread of divine favor into the very fabric of these places, and that thread was spun with pure gold. But just downstream, the silence was deafening. In the settlements whose currents were declared abandoned or spiritually blighted, the lifeblood of commerce simply stopped flowing. The once bustling markets now held only echoes, the stalls standing empty. The innkeepers shuttered their windows, and the dockworkers were forced to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The wealth of a community built over generations could evaporate in a single season, all based on a spiritual decree. This created a brutal and immediate divide, a line drawn not by geography but by faith. This economic rupture inevitably spilled over into the halls of secular power. A local baron who had grown rich from tolls collected on the old iron route now watched his treasury shrink, while his rival, whose lands bordered the newly blessed channel, saw his income double. Resentment festered, sometimes boiling over into minor skirmishes over land rights or disputed taxes. These were not grand wars, but a constant, low-grade friction fueled by economic displacement. The river priests, often secluded in their monasteries, rarely saw the direct consequences of their words. They were spiritual figures, yet their pronouncements acted with the force of economic policy, arbitrarily picking winners and losers across the medieval landscape. One man's divine vision was another man's financial ruin. How could such a volatile system, built on the shifting sands of faith, possibly hold power for centuries without collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions? The Po Diviner saw patterns in the water that no one else could read. He stood on the banks of Italy's great river, practicing the ancient art of hydromancy, a form of divination where the future was written in the ripples and currents. His pronouncements were sought by farmers and lords alike, but his most dramatic intervention was reserved for the high-stakes world of silk. One season, he declared that the river's spiritual essence, its very soul, had shifted. The energies that made the waters friendly to silk, that protected the delicate threads on their long journey, had abandoned the main southern channel. They now flowed, he insisted, through a northern distributary that led toward the city of Milan. This was far more than a spiritual observation. It was an economic declaration of war. Silk was the ultimate luxury good, a river of gold flowing overland from the east. For years, the powerful merchants of Venice had dominated this trade, their control of the southern Po channels giving them a stranglehold on wealth and influence. The diviner's new prophecy offered a divine shortcut, a way for Milan to break that monopoly. The declaration was given a tangible, miraculous proof. Soon after his announcement, villagers along the new northern route began finding shimmering silken threads caught on the reeds, as if the river itself had woven them there as a sign of its blessing. It was a masterful piece of theater, almost certainly staged, but its effect was undeniable. Merchants, superstitious about their fragile and priceless cargo, could not ignore such a powerful omen. Why risk the spiritual rot of a disfavored channel when a blessed path lay open? Slowly at first, and then in a flood, the caravans from the east altered their course. The lucrative silk trade was rerouted, flowing away from Venetian-controlled waters and directly into the hands of Milanese traders. A single priest reading the will of a river had become a weapon in a silent war between city-states. His spiritual authority was the perfect cover for a brutal economic gambit, proving that the currents of faith could be channeled to serve the most worldly of ambitions. Her mornings began in the pre-dawn stillness, her eyes fixed on the water's shifting palette. The priestess known as the Garonne's seer did not listen for whispers or study the currents, she watched for color. She believed the river revealed its sacred moods through the specific hues it reflected at the first touch of sunrise. One particular morning, she saw it, a deep, liquid violet bleeding across the water's surface, a shade she declared was the river's own blessing made visible. This color, she announced, was a divine sign specifically for the ships carrying the most precious cargo of all, rare dyes from the Mediterranean. These were not just pigments, they were wealth in solid form, the crushed insects and rare mollusks that produced the crimson and purple coveted by kings and cardinals. Her proclamation transformed a vague spiritual practice into a precise economic tool. Merchants planning voyages to procure these dyes would now journey to her riverside sanctuary, seeking her confirmation that the violet hue was present. A positive reading from the seer became a form of spiritual insurance, a guarantee that the river god would protect their fragile, priceless cargo from spoilage or shipwreck. This single, sensory-based authority began to pull the entire dye trade toward her. Instead of dispersing across various ports, the merchants started to consolidate their operations in Toulouse, the major city on her stretch of the Garonne. It was the logical place to await her blessing and to unload their sacred cargo under the river's continued favor. The economic effect was a powerful concentration of a niche industry. The constant, reliable arrival of raw dyes attracted master dyers and textile artisans from across Europe. They settled in Toulouse, knowing they would have first access to the best materials, all sanctified by the river's colorful blessing. The city rapidly evolved into a specialized hub, its reputation built not just on commerce, but on the perceived purity and superior quality that the seer's blessing provided. A local textile economy flourished, producing cloths that were famed as much for their spiritual provenance as for their vibrant, lasting colors. The seer's unique authority, rooted in something as ephemeral as a sunrise reflection, had carved out a formidable economic advantage for one city and one industry, proving that faith could be as precise and profitable as any merchant's ledger. His life was a testament to extreme denial, a hermit living in a damp cave where the river Elbe echoed against the stone. This anchorite priest had forsaken all worldly comforts to achieve a single goal, direct and unmediated communion with the river god. His authority was not built on public ritual, but on the sheer, terrifying force of his asceticism. People believed that a man who ate so little and slept on cold rock must be hearing truths that were drowned out by the noise of ordinary life. Then, from the silence of his cave, he issued a decree that seemed bizarrely specific. The river god, he declared, would no longer tolerate timber barges built from just any wood. The spirit of the Elbe would only accept and protect vessels constructed from a single type of locally sourced oak. This was not a suggestion about shipbuilding, it was a spiritual ultimatum. Timber was the skeleton of medieval expansion, and the great barges floating down the Elbe from Scandinavian forests carried the planks and beams for building entire cities. The merchants hailing from distant lands initially scoffed at the hermit's strange demand. Why should they change their proven, efficient shipbuilding practices for the whim of a man who lived in a hole? But then the stories began to circulate. A barge built from foreign wood, ignoring the decree, was said to have splintered apart on a calm stretch of river for no apparent reason. Another, carrying a vital load of mast timbers, was found drifting aimlessly. Its crew vanished, as if the river itself had rejected the vessel. Whether these events were coincidence, sabotage, or pure invention did not matter. They were interpreted as the river god's wrath, a divine enforcement of the anchorite's word. Fear is a powerful negotiator. The Scandinavian merchants, reliant on the river's goodwill to deliver their cargo, had no choice but to comply. They began sourcing their shipbuilding timber exclusively from the local forests the priest had specified. This single spiritual mandate completely rerouted an ancillary trade network. The local woodcutters, once struggling, suddenly found their oak in soaring demand. Their quiet villages transformed into bustling hubs of activity, their axes ringing through forests that were now deemed holy. The anchorite, without ever leaving his cave or touching a single coin, had imposed a production standard on an international trade network. His extreme isolation was the very source of his power, proving that the most specific and worldly economic commands could flow from a source of pure, uncompromising faith. The Rune-Caster stones clattered onto the wet gravel of the Thames bank, their ancient symbols facing up toward a grey sky. His interpretation was swift and severe. The main channel flowing directly past London's bustling docks, he declared, now carried a spiritual curse aimed specifically at foreign merchants and their goods. He claimed the runes revealed the river's own displeasure with the city's greed, a divine judgment written in water and stone, for any captain from distant lands to sail that water was to risk not just his cargo but his very soul. The true path of blessing, according to the stones, now lay along a smaller, quieter tributary that curled away from the city, a waterway that completely bypassed London's control. This was not a random spiritual event. Upstream towns, watching London's wealth and influence grow at their expense, had found their perfect weapon. They could not compete with the city's markets or defeat its militia, but they could fund a priest who could redirect the very faith that guided commerce. The Rune-Caster's decree gave merchants a divine excuse to avoid London's heavy tolls and restrictive guilds. For a time, it worked brilliantly. Ships from the continent, filled with Flemish cloth and French wine, began turning away from the cursed main channel. They followed the newly blessed tributary, guided by the promise of safe passage and salvation, their business now enriching the smaller upstream towns instead of the capital. London's custom houses saw a sudden, puzzling drop in revenue. Its markets felt the absence of exotic goods. The city's commercial dominance, which seemed so secure, was being subtly undermined not by a blockade or an army, but by a story told with a handful of carved rocks. This was economic warfare waged with spiritual tools, a brilliant demonstration that the most potent way to attack a city was not to breach its walls, but to reroute the river of belief that flowed toward its gates. But a river's path could also be carved by human hands and then sanctified by divine word. On the mighty Rhone, a bishop who was also a master of waterworks saw a different way to redirect faith and fortune. He understood the river's restless nature, its tendency to silt up old channels and seek new ones, and he decided to lend a helping hand. With the resources of his diocese and his own knowledge of hydrology, he directed the construction of a small, artificial canal, a shortcut that bypassed a slow, treacherous bend in the river. This was a feat of engineering, a practical solution to a known navigational problem. Yet he knew that logic alone would not be enough to persuade the superstitious bargemen. So upon its completion, he staged an event of profound spiritual theater. He led a grand procession of chanting clergy to the new waterway, swinging censers that filled the air with sacred smoke. He stood at the canal's entrance and performed a mass baptism of the waters, declaring this human-made channel to be the river's new, divinely approved path. His blessing transformed the canal from a mere ditch into a sacred conduit. The merchants faced no crisis of conscience. Here was a bishop, a spiritual authority, endorsing a route that was also demonstrably faster and safer. His dual identity as both engineer and priest resolved any doubt. The barges did not just slowly adopt the new path, they flocked to it, trusting both the holy water and the sound engineering. Trade flourished along this new artery, and the wealth it generated flowed directly into the bishop's own diocese, funding new churches and strengthening his temporal power. This was perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation of all, a fusion of faith and science where the sacred current was not just found but manufactured. The river was not a thing to be controlled but a person to be understood. This was the core of hydraulic divinity, a theology where every waterway possessed a conscious will, a divine personality capable of profound blessings or terrifying wrath. Think of it not as primitive superstition, but as a complete and logical worldview. In this cosmology, water was the ultimate liminal element, a sacred threshold separating the world of the living from the realm of spirits and gods. To travel on a river was to cross that boundary, to place your fate in the hands of a conscious entity. This belief transformed the river priest from a simple holy man into an essential translator. His sacred duty was to read the river's mood, to interpret its divine intentions through signs that were invisible to the common eye. The specific way water swirled around a rock could indicate approval. A sudden change in the water's color, from muddy brown to a clear, deep green, might signal a shift in its spiritual disposition. Even the behavior of the river's wildlife held meaning. A heron standing silently on a particular bank was not just a bird, it was a sentinel placed by the river god itself. This interpretive skill was not learned from a book. It was considered a divine gift, a form of sacred insight that allowed the priest to perceive the wishes of a living god. This complex theology is what made the priest's economic power not just possible but legitimate. When a merchant was commanded to abandon a fast, efficient route for a longer, more difficult one, he was not merely obeying a man, he was submitting to the will of a deity. Redirecting his barge was an act of religious obedience, a necessary step to avoid spiritual pollution and divine retribution. His pragmatism was not discarded, it was simply redefined. What could be more practical than ensuring your ship and your soul were both safe? Why would a wealthy, calculating trader risk everything by angering a power that could, with a single thought, conjure a fog to blind him or a sandbar to break his ship? His ledger books and his prayers were 2 pages of the same text. This deep, shared belief system was the invisible architecture supporting every trade shift, every redirected current of wealth. It was the reason why faith could move mountains of goods simply by moving the human heart. The Vistula River slept under a thick blanket of ice, its currents locked in a silent, frozen prayer. At its edge stood a priest whose power was measured not in distance but in days. They called him the snow melter, and his authority was absolute over the most anticipated event of the year, the spring thaw. While other priests shifted water, he manipulated time itself. His unfreezing rituals were a sacred theater that everyone, from the lowliest trapper to the wealthiest merchant, believed could coax the river god from its winter slumber. The start of the amber trading season depended entirely on his word. No barge could move, no shipment could depart, until he declared the ice broken and the currents blessed. This gave him a power more subtle and profound than any curse. He could delay. If a particular consortium of amber merchants had displeased him, perhaps by failing to provide a generous offering to his riverside shrine, his response was not a dramatic curse but a strategic silence. He would simply postpone his rituals for a specific, crucial branch of the river. The ice would remain solid, the barges trapped at their docks, while the merchants watched the calendar with growing dread. Meanwhile, his favored partners, those who had shown proper devotion, would find their branch of the Vistula miraculously thawed days or even weeks earlier. They enjoyed a clear, blessed path to the Baltic coast, the sole source of the precious fossilized resin. This temporal head start was an economic weapon of immense power. Amber was a luxury good with a limited seasonal window for collection and transport. The first shipments to reach the markets of Venice and Constantinople commanded astronomical prices, setting the value for the entire year. By controlling who left first, the snow melter was not just blessing a route, he was dictating the market price for a continent. His spiritual authority over a natural event allowed him to create an artificial scarcity, a bottleneck in time that funneled immense profits to his allies. He proved that the most valuable current was not the fastest one, but the first one. The river's blessing could be carried on a melody. Along the winding Douro in Portugal, a priest known as the hymnist did not merely pray for the waters, he sang to them. His voice, rising in ancient chants, was believed to calm the river's temperament and protect the precious cargo floating upon it, the region's distinctive, robust wine. Each hymn was a spiritual contract, a plea for safe passage that the wine growers trusted with absolute faith. Then the hymnist made a subtle but decisive change. He altered the sacred lyrics, shifting the focus of the river's favor from several small landings to one specific, deep water harbor. In the new verses, this single port was named as the sole recipient of the river's grace, the only place from which a blessed journey was guaranteed. The effect on the superstitious vintners was immediate and total. They became convinced that their wine, if shipped from any other point along the river, would be spiritually vulnerable. It might spoil on the journey or worse, lose the unique character the local terroir had given it. A divine stamp of approval was now exclusively placed on one location. Almost overnight, the wine trade began to consolidate. Growers from across the region directed their ox carts laden with barrels toward this newly anointed harbor. What was once a dispersed network of exporters funneled into a single, booming hub. The port's warehouses expanded to hold the endless stream of barrels, and its docks grew to accommodate the ships bound for England and beyond. This concentrated flow of blessed wine forged a powerful brand identity. The product itself became synonymous with the port from which it sailed, eventually giving the world the name we know today, port wine. The hymnist's musical redirection did more than just create a busy harbor. It founded an entire city whose identity and wealth were built on a song. His art demonstrates that cultural practices could be powerful economic tools, capable of carving not just trade routes, but legacies into the landscape itself. Yet for all their power, these spiritual decrees did not go unchallenged. The air around a newly blessed tributary often crackled with tension as much as with faith. Practical merchants, their fortunes built on reliable calculations, sometimes pushed back. They hired their own experts, men known as waterfinders or channel masters, to survey the new routes. These early hydrologists would measure depths and chart currents, presenting scrolls filled with data to prove that the priest's sacred path was, in fact, shallower or more treacherous than the old one. This created a fascinating clash of worldviews right on the riverbank, a debate between the logic of the sounding line and the authority of divine revelation. Rival priests from different cults or competing monasteries would also publicly dispute these proclamations, each claiming a truer connection to the river god and accusing the other of corruption or false prophecy. The most direct opposition, however, came from the nobles and city councils whose coffers were draining. They did not just grumble in their castles. There are records of secret meetings and bags of silver coin being offered to a priest's order, a blatant attempt to purchase a reversal of a heavenly decree. One chronicle even tells of a baron who threatened to dam a blessed channel entirely, a physical threat against a spiritual idea. This constant friction reveals a crucial truth about the medieval economy. It was not a landscape of simple, universal belief, but a vibrant and often contentious arena where faith, skepticism, and raw profit were in perpetual negotiation. A river priest's authority was never absolute. It was a carefully maintained performance, and his success hinged entirely on his ability to preserve an unshakable aura of spiritual credibility against these very earthly pressures. His next miracle had to be more convincing than the last, his interpretation of a flood more authoritative than a rival's. How did these men of faith manage to keep their followers in line against such powerful, logical opposition? Their methods were as varied as the rivers they served. The Moselle's vineyard vicar held the river's favor in his hands, and he knew precisely how to sell it. While other priests redirected entire currents, he focused his spiritual authority on a single, lucrative product, the region's celebrated wine. His decree was both simple and brilliant. He announced that the Moselle's blessing, its divine protection against spoilage and souring, would no longer flow freely. From that day forward, the river god's favor would only cling to wine barrels that bore his personal seal. For a fee, of course, this was not a donation or a voluntary offering. It was a mandatory payment, a spiritual toll gate placed directly on the flow of commerce. Merchants did not hesitate. They believed with absolute certainty that an unsealed barrel was a cursed barrel, its contents doomed to turn to vinegar on the journey to market. Paying the vicar's fee was not an expense, it was an investment in their product's very soul. They lined up at his riverside chapel, coin in hand, to have his sacred mark burned into the wood of their casks. The revenue this generated was immense, a steady stream of silver that funded the expansion of his church, the gilding of its altars, and the broadening of his own influence far beyond the vineyard slopes. Here, the sacred and the commercial became indistinguishable. The vicar had monetized faith itself, creating a proto-tax system that operated entirely outside any king's law. His spiritual authority was the state, the law, and the tax collector, all rolled into one. People paid him not out of fear of prison, but out of fear of a soured vintage, proving that the most effective tax is one you believe in. The Tagus River carried more than water. It carried the lifeblood of a kingdom, golden currents flowing from the mines of the interior. Upon its banks, a priest known as the Stargazer looked not to the water for his answers, but to the heavens. His authority was written in the constellations, a complex art of astrological divination that mapped celestial movements onto the river's own flow. He would spend nights charting the positions of planets and stars, then emerge at dawn to declare which days were blessed for a very specific cargo, gold. Only on these rare, auspicious dates, he proclaimed, would the river and sky align to offer divine protection to the barges. This was not a vague spiritual forecast, it was a precise scheduling of grace. His decrees created a powerful, artificial rhythm in the gold trade. For his allied merchants, those who supported his temple and followed his celestial guidance, this system was a perfect shield. They would consolidate their shipments and wait for the Stargazer's green light. Launching on a blessed day meant their heavily laden barges traveled in a state of spiritual security, the river itself believed to hide them from the eyes of pirates lurking downstream. These chosen convoys would arrive at the Lisbon docks safely and predictably, their arrival timed to meet a market hungry for new gold, allowing them to command the highest possible prices. But for merchants outside this privileged circle, the choice was brutal. They could either wait for a blessing that might not come for weeks, watching their capital sit idle, or they could risk the journey on an unblessed day. Many, driven by debt or ambition, chose to risk it. Their barges, sailing under a spiritually hostile sky, were seen as unprotected, tempting targets for both the river's natural perils and the bandits who preyed upon them. The Stargazer never cursed a route or a channel, he cursed time itself. By controlling the calendar, he manipulated the entire market, creating surges of supply that benefited his allies and leaving his rivals exposed. His celestial charts were less a map of the stars and more a blueprint for building a commercial monopoly. proving that the most valuable secrets were not found in the earth but in the sky. A simple stone bridge arched over the placid waters of the Meuse, but its true power lay in the ghost who was said to inhabit it. Long after his death, a local priest was venerated as a saint, and his successors, the guardians of his shrine, began to spread a remarkable claim. They declared that any tool or piece of hardware passing beneath the saint's bridge on a barge would receive his enduring blessing, a touch of divine favor that made it stronger, sharper, and more durable than any ordinary implement. The ironmongers and toolmakers of the region, whose livelihoods depended on the reputation of their wares, could not ignore such a promise. In a world where a blacksmith's skill was revered but still vulnerable to the flaws in raw iron, a guaranteed blessing was the ultimate competitive edge. One by one, they began to relocate their forges and workshops to the riverbanks near the bridge, ensuring their axes, plowshares, and nails would all make the sacred transit. This was not a subtle shift, it was the birth of a localized monopoly. Soon, the clang of hammers and the roar of bellows became the constant music of that stretch of the river. The reputation of Meuse bridge tools spread far and wide. A farmer purchasing a blessed axe believed it would hold its edge through a season of work. A carpenter buying blessed nails trusted they would not bend or split the finest wood. This perceived divine enhancement was a mark of quality that no competitor could easily replicate, allowing the artisans to charge premium prices that customers were willing to pay without question. The cult of the bridge saint had been masterfully extended from the realm of pure spirit into the very tangible world of manufacturing and commerce. It created a powerful, faith-based brand long before the concept of branding even existed, proving that the memory of a holy man could be harnessed to shape not just belief, but the entire geography of an industry. The echoes of those 25 river priests did not vanish with the last medieval hymn. Their legacy is written into the very structure of our modern world, flowing silently through our legal systems and economic theories. Consider the fierce legal battles fought today over water rights. When states or nations argue in court over the allocation of a river's flow, they are reenacting a secular version of the priest's spiritual decrees. The underlying conflict is the same, a struggle to control an essential resource and dictate who may benefit from its current. The authority has simply shifted from divine revelation to legal precedent, but the fundamental contest over a river's bounty remains unchanged. This historical connection reveals that our modern concept of resource ownership has deep spiritual roots. The priest's most profound impact, however, may be in the field of behavioral economics. Modern scholars study how irrational beliefs and powerful narratives can dramatically alter financial decisions and market outcomes. The river priests were masters of this phenomenon centuries before it had a name. They demonstrated that the story attached to a resource could be more powerful than the resource itself. A merchant choosing a longer, costlier route based on a blessing was making a decision that defied pure logic, yet made perfect sense within his worldview. This is the same psychological mechanism that drives modern consumer behavior, where a brand story can command a premium price far beyond a product's material cost. We may no longer have priests baptizing canals, but the principle they wielded is more relevant than ever. The flow of global capital is constantly being redirected by narratives, by market perceptions, and by the authority of influential voices. A central bank statement can shift investments as decisively as any sacred pronouncement. A tech visionary's promise can create a boomtown as quickly as a river blessing. The currents have changed from water to digital information, but the human psychology that guides their course is ancient. Understanding this forgotten history allows us to see the invisible architecture of our economy, reminding us that the most powerful forces shaping our world are not always made of concrete and steel, but of belief and story. He could make the ocean wait. On the muddy banks of the Scheldt estuary, a priest known as the Tide Caller performed rituals that seemed to define nature itself. His congregation was not just the local villagers, but the masters of the Flemish cloth guilds, men whose fortunes were woven from the finest wool in Europe. They watched as he chanted, his arms raised not to a statue, but to the vast grey waters of the incoming tide. His claim was as audacious as it was simple. Through his sacred rites, he could hold the high tide at its peak, suspending the relentless pull of the moon for just a few extra, crucial hours. This was not about calming a storm or blessing a current. This was about manipulating time and space on a grand, elemental scale. For the cloth merchants of Bruges, his power was a key that unlocked a geographic prison. Their massive, deep-draft ships, loaded to the gunwales with expensive cloth, were normally stopped by the estuary's shallow waters far from their final inland destinations. They would have to unload their precious cargo onto smaller, more expensive barges at specific transshipment points, paying heavy tolls and handling fees that cut deeply into their profits. But with the Tide Caller's blessing, they believed their great ships could glide further up the river than any tide should allow, sailing right past those costly way stations. The perceived miracle was not a sudden calm or a cleared channel, but an extended dock. A ship would find the water remaining deep at a quayside for hours after it should have receded, a phenomenon the merchants saw as direct divine intervention. This single spiritual service gave the Bruges cloth fleet a staggering commercial advantage. They could deliver their goods faster, cheaper, and with less risk of damage from repeated loading and unloading. The Tide Caller's authority over the lunar cycle became a form of supernatural logistics, a way to compress supply chains and bypass entrenched middlemen through sheer force of belief. He demonstrated that the most valuable power was not the ability to move water, but to halt its retreat, holding back the sea itself for the sake of commerce. His predictions arrived with the first chill winds, a forecast carved not from data but from divine insight. The priest known as the Oda's Ice Prophet held a singular power over the river's most transformative phase, its solid, silent winter. While other priests commanded liquid currents, he mastered the frozen ones. His legendary skill was predicting the exact day the Oda would freeze solid enough to bear weight, and the precise moment weeks or months later when its icy shell would crack and surrender to the spring thaw. This was not seen as meteorology, it was revered as divination, a direct line to the river god's winter mind, and with this knowledge he performed his annual miracle. He would walk out onto the newly formed ice, test its thickness with a ceremonial staff, and then declare a sacred ice bridge now open for passage. This was not a physical structure, but a spiritual corridor, a path sanctified for the heavy sleds of the grain merchants. Suddenly, the dead of winter became a season of frantic commerce. The summer river passage for grain barges was slow, winding, and expensive, hindered by unpredictable currents and shifting sandbars. The ice bridge, however, was a straight, smooth highway. Grain merchants could load their sleds and race them directly across the frozen river, cutting days off the journey and slashing the cost of transport. The prophet's uncannily accurate predictions were the key that unlocked this entire system. Merchants could plan their massive winter shipments with absolute confidence, knowing the sacred bridge would be open on the day they needed it, and that it would remain safe until the exact day he prophesied its end. This transformed the seasonal rhythm of the grain trade. A time of year once associated with scarcity and isolation became a period of booming activity and profit. The ice prophet's real power was a brilliant fusion of sharp observation and spiritual theater. He almost certainly used subtle environmental clues, the behavior of animals, the quality of the early morning frost, patterns his lifetime of watching had taught him. But by framing this practical knowledge as divine prophecy, he gave it an unshakable authority that merchants could bank their fortunes on. He demonstrated that the most revolutionary economic paradigms are often just old, practical truths dressed in the robes of faith. Her nightly ritual was a form of liquid communion. While others slept, the priestess known as the Moon Bather waded into the dark currents of the Guadalquivir, her skin silvered by the lunar glow. She did not merely pray over the water, she immersed herself in it, performing a sacred baptism under the open sky. She emerged from these nocturnal rites with a profound declaration that the river now carried the moon's own essence, a blessing specifically reserved for one precious cargo, the region's golden olive oil. This was not a general benediction for all trade, it was a targeted spiritual enhancement. She designated a very specific, otherwise unremarkable stretch of the riverbank as the sole point of transfer. Any oil barge that loaded its ceramic amphorae at this consecrated site, she promised, would be imbued with the moon's protective grace for the entire journey to the markets of Seville. The olive growers, whose lives were dictated by the rhythms of sun and soil, found this lunar logic irresistibly compelling. They became convinced that oil loaded elsewhere was merely a commodity, but oil loaded at her blessed bank was a sanctified product, guaranteed against rancidity and spiritual decay. Almost overnight, the entire regional trade began to constrict toward this single point. What had been a dispersed process of loading at various private docks transformed into a concentrated operation at her village. The riverbank exploded with activity, a forest of cranes lifting countless amphorae from ox carts onto waiting barges. The village itself thrived, its inns housing the growers, its taverns serving the bargemen, its coopers and cartwrights working day and night to support the blessed trade. The Moon Bather had not just blessed a route, she had created a brand. The story of her ritual and the moon-kissed oil spread through the markets of Seville. Buyers soon asked not just for olive oil, but for the oil from the moon-blessed port. This narrative of divine favor allowed merchants to command a significantly higher price, a premium paid for a story as much as for the substance itself. Her genius was in weaving spectacle and nature worship into an unbreakable commercial advantage, proving that the most powerful branding could be written not on a label, but in moonlight on water. A story could be as powerful as any blessing or curse whispered over the water. On the wide, misty expanse of Ireland's River Shannon, a priest known simply as the storyteller wielded this subtle art. He did not command the currents or read signs in the water's flow. His stage was the fireside and the tavern, his tools the ancient tales passed down through generations. He understood that the deepest currents in any culture are those of memory and myth, and he decided to redirect one. He began to tell a new story, a fresh legend woven into the old fabric. He spoke of a gentle river spirit, a guardian of the Shannon, who held a special fondness for the hides of animals. But this spirit, he claimed, would only bestow its enduring softness and strength upon leather treated with the tannin from a specific, locally abundant type of oak bark. This was not a decree from a robed authority, but a seed planted in the fertile soil of shared belief. The story spread from village to village, told and retold until it felt as ancient as the river itself. Hide processors who had long used various methods began to adopt this one specific technique. It was not mandated by law, but by something far stronger, the compelling power of a good tale. They believed, or their customers came to believe, that leather treated with the local bark was inherently superior, touched by the spirit's favor. merchants, always alert for a competitive edge, soon took notice. They began to specifically seek out these spirit-approved hides, knowing they could market them as a premium product. A buyer purchasing a saddle or a pair of boots made from this leather was not just buying an object, they were buying a piece of the legend, a tangible connection to the river's guardian. Almost imperceptibly, the entire hide trade began to tilt. The subtle pressure of narrative shifted the supply chain, redirecting demand and capital toward the tanneries and producers within the storyteller's region. His influence did not rely on miracles or fear, but on the quiet, relentless force of a story well told. He proved that the most durable changes to an economy are not always carved by decree, but are whispered into existence, one retold tale at a time. A sudden squall on the Volga could turn a fortune in furs into a waterlogged ruin. Upon this vast, unpredictable river, a priest known as the Storm Queller built his authority on the merchant's most primal fear, the capricious rage of the weather. He did not redirect currents or bless new channels. His power was one of pure protection, a spiritual shield against the river's fury. He offered a specific and valuable service, a safe passage blessing, guaranteed to calm the winds and still the waves for any fur-laden boat that carried his sacred endorsement. This blessing, however, was never free. It required a significant donation to his remote riverside monastery, a payment that merchants came to see not as a cost but as a vital insurance premium. The entire trade rhythm of the northern fur caravans began to bend around his availability. These caravans, arriving from the deep forests laden with sable, ermine, and fox pelts, would not risk the treacherous river journey without his blessing. They would wait, their valuable cargo piling up at the river ports, until they could secure an audience with the priest and purchase his spiritual guarantee. This created a powerful bottleneck, a deliberate choke point in the flow of one of the medieval world's most lucrative trades. By controlling the timing of departures, the Storm Queller gained immense influence over the volume of furs entering the southern markets. If he blessed many caravans at once, a glut would arrive in cities like Kazan, depressing prices. If he was slow to grant his favor, a trickle of furs would create scarcity and drive prices upward. His monastery grew wealthy, its walls fortified by the silver of merchants who paid willingly for the one thing they could not engineer themselves, a sense of safety. He sold peace of mind, proving that in a world ruled by unseen forces, the most valuable commodity was the belief in a calm passage. He drew the divine connections with ink and faith. The priest known as the Adage map maker saw the river not just as water, but as a spiritual artery, and he possessed the rare skill to translate that vision onto parchment. Working in his scriptorium in northern Italy, he produced maps of breathtaking detail, charting the course of the Adage with geographical precision. Yet his true genius lay in the layers of meaning he added. Upon these accurate foundations, he drew in shimmering gold leaf what he called the divine currents, ethereal pathways that flowed from the river itself, snaking up into the surrounding Alps to touch specific high mountain passes. These were not arbitrary lines. He presented his work not as his own invention, but as a revelation, a cartography inspired by visions that showed him the river god's preferred paths into the heart of Germany. For a merchant in Verona staring at such a map, the message was unmistakably clear. The river's blessing did not end at its banks. It extended like an invisible road, a sacred guarantee of safety and prosperity for any caravan that followed its golden trail over the designated peaks. This spiritual cartography created a powerful incentive. Suddenly, the arduous journey over the Brenner Pass, for instance, was not just a difficult trek through the mountains. It was a pilgrimage along a blessed corridor, A merchant could load his goods onto a barge on the Adige, travel with the river's favor, then transfer his cargo to mules at the foot of the mountains, confident that the divine current would protect his train all the way to the markets of Augsburg or Nuremberg. The mapmaker did not need to command or curse. He simply provided the information, beautifully rendered and sanctified, and the merchants willingly followed. His maps became the trusted guides for a generation, directing the flow of spices, cloth, and ideas along a specific overland network he had effectively anointed. This was the ultimate form of information control. By creating the authoritative sacred map, he wielded power over geography itself, proving that whoever draws the trusted chart can redirect the very routes of civilization. A merchant's dream could be more valuable than any map. Along the winding Severn River, a priest known as the Dream Interpreter turned the subconscious fears and hopes of traders into a powerful economic tool. He did not issue public curses or lead grand ceremonies. His method was far more personal, conducted in the quiet of his riverside cell where anxious merchants came to share their restless nights. He would listen intently to their visions of stormy waters or paths blocked by fallen trees, then offer his spiritual analysis. A dream of a soaring eagle might mean a northern tributary was blessed, while a vision of a rotting fish could signal a spiritual blight on the southern route. His interpretations were not random. Over time, a clear pattern emerged. The routes he consistently endorsed through these dream readings always seemed to channel traffic toward the copper-rich lands controlled by a single, wealthy patron. A merchant who dreamed of a bright, coppery sun was told it was a divine sign to ship his goods through a specific set of mountain passes, directly into the heart of his patron's mining domain. These personalized readings felt profoundly authentic. A trader was not obeying a distant spiritual authority, but acting on a message he believed had come from his own soul, expertly decoded by a trusted guide. The interpreter's reputation for clairvoyance grew with every successful journey, each safe passage seen as proof of his gift. Copper, the reddish metal vital for coinage and cookware, began to flow along a dedicated spiritual corridor, its path charted not by royal decree, but by the interpreted dreams of individual merchants. This was manipulation through intimacy, a system where trust was the currency and the human psyche was the lever. He demonstrated that the most effective way to redirect commerce was not to command a crowd, but to convince one person at a time that their own subconscious was pointing the way. The festival was not merely a celebration, but a movable feast of commerce. Each year, the priest known as the Mans Festival Master orchestrated a grand spectacle, a week-long event that combined solemn river blessings with a bustling, chaotic trade fair. His genius lay in the calendar and the map, for he never held the festival in the same place twice. One year it would be in a bustling town, the next in a sleepy village further upstream, and then the following season in a hamlet downstream. This annual migration transformed the entire regional economy into a fluid, unpredictable entity. The town chosen for that year's honor was instantly catapulted into prosperity. Its inns overflowed with merchants who had traveled for weeks. Its main square, usually quiet, became a labyrinth of stalls selling everything from Flemish cloth to Eastern spices. Local artisans and food sellers could earn enough in that single week to sustain them for the entire year. But when the festival packed up and moved on, the boom evaporated just as quickly, leaving the town in a quiet that felt deeper than before. This cycle of feast and famine gave the festival master a power more flexible than any curse or blessing. He could reward a loyal ally by placing the festival in their domain, funneling a year's worth of wealth directly into their coffers. Conversely, he could punish a rival or a town that had defied him by deliberately bypassing them, leaving their markets silent and their warehouses full of unsold goods while their neighbors thrived. He did not control a single trade route, but the very geography of opportunity itself. His authority demonstrated that the flow of wealth could be orchestrated not just through sacred decrees, but through the strategic planning of a major cultural event. He was a spatial economist long before the term existed, using the pull of a festival to dynamically redistribute commercial life across the river valley, proving that sometimes the most powerful current is a current of people. His weir was a simple barrier of wood and stone, a humble structure across the river main, but in his hands it became a sacred gateway. The priest known as the lock-keeper did not command the currents themselves, but the very height of the water. He managed a primitive but effective system of gates and channels, a physical mechanism that could raise or lower the water level to allow boats to pass through difficult stretches of the river. Yet he never spoke of levers or hydraulics. He framed every operation as a profound spiritual negotiation. To open the weir and grant passage, he would announce the river spirit first had to be appeased. He would perform elaborate rites at the water's edge, chanting and making offerings until he declared the deity's mood had shifted from restless to calm. Only then, with the spirit suitably honored, would he allow his acolytes to physically work the wooden beams, raising the gates so the merchants' barges could glide through. The fee he demanded was never called a toll. It was a spiritual offering, a necessary donation to fund the costly rituals and precious sacrifices needed to keep the river spirit content. For the merchants, this was not a choice. They believed that a barge attempting to pass through an unappeased weir would be met with disaster. The spirit might suddenly lower the water, stranding the ship on the muddy bottom, or worse, release a surge that would dash it against the wooden barriers. Paying the lock-keeper was not just paying for a service, it was purchasing a divine intervention, a vital favor without which their journey could not safely continue. This was the ultimate fusion of practical need and spiritual belief. The lock-keeper held a monopoly on a crucial piece of infrastructure, and by sacralizing its operation, he transformed a simple mechanical process into a mandatory religious experience. His spiritual toll prefigured the modern user fees we pay to cross a bridge or transit a canal, but with one crucial difference. Today, we pay for the maintenance of concrete and steel. Then, merchants paid for the maintenance of a god's goodwill, proving that the earliest forms of economic infrastructure were often built not of stone, but of story. A pilgrim's blood stained the riverbank, a vivid splash of crimson against the pale stones. The priest they called the Ebro's blood stopper knelt, his hands not on a wound but in the water itself. Along the dusty, arduous road to Santiago de Compostela, his shrine became a beacon of hope. He was the 25th and final priest in our story, and his power was not over cargo, but over human bodies and souls. His reputation for miraculous healing spread like wildfire along the pilgrimage routes. A sprained ankle mended overnight, a fever broken with a splash of river water, a deep gash that refused to fester after his blessing. These were the stories that desperate travelers carried with them. Then he made his great pronouncement. He declared that the river's current flowing directly past his humble shrine was imbued with a unique divine property, a healing essence that could cure ailments of the flesh and spirit. This was not a command to avoid a channel, but an invitation to immerse oneself in it. The economic effect was immediate and transformative. Pilgrims began to plan their entire journeys around a stop at his stretch of the Ebro. What was once a trickle of the faithful became a river of humanity. This sudden, sustained influx of people created an entire economy from nothing. Enterprising locals built inns and hostels to shelter the weary. Food stalls appeared, selling hot meals to travelers from a dozen different lands. Artisans began crafting and selling lead badges and other souvenirs as tangible proof of their visit and the healing they received. Guides offered their services to lead people to the exact spot in the current where the blessing was strongest. A new, vibrant trade route was born, but it was not one of silk or amber or wine. It was a route of spiritual tourism, a highway of faith where the primary commodity was service and experience. The Bloodstopper's influence demonstrates the ultimate evolution of the river priest's power. He did not redirect existing trade. He generated an entirely new form of commerce. His reputation for miracle working itself became the economic engine, proving that the most powerful blessing could be the ability to make people believe in a cure and, in doing so, build a world around that belief. Their stories flow together into a single, powerful truth about the medieval world. The 25 river priests prove that faith was not some abstract concept. It was a tangible, physical force in the marketplace. From the blessed tributaries of the Rhine to the healing currents of the Ebro, we have traced how spiritual authority, wielded through decree, ritual, and story, could carve new trade routes out of nothing and silence old ones with a single word. It built thriving ports like the home of port wine and concentrated entire industries like the toolmakers of the Meuse. This hidden history forces us to reconsider what economics truly is. It is never just a cold calculation of numbers and logistics on a ledger. It is a living system, deeply intertwined with the messy, beautiful complexities of human belief, cultural stories, and collective psychology. The legacy of these priests stands as a profound testament to a simple idea that powerful ideas can move more than just water, they can move entire worlds. If this journey through the sacred economies of the past has captivated you, we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more explorations into the hidden histories that shape our lives.